want to take the opportunity here to explain, dissect the French Revolution test grade questions. If you look at the rubric, it has some information on it, and it breaks it down by category, and that's what you're going to do with these particular questions. So the first one, of course, is asking you to, and you had this one attached last semester if you started it, but if you didn't, we still need to look at it. I'm going to hide my fat head here. Describe how social, economic, and political conditions before the French Revolution affected ordinary citizens. How were these conditions related to the tipping point, the spark, the storming of the Bastille? So the rubric, and highlight the following colors how you've addressed these criteria. How did you address deficit and taxes? That's one of the things in the rubric. As a factor, how did you address unfair treatment of the third estate? So you need to highlight that. How did you address the political aspects in the estates general? So again, the social, economic, and political deficit and taxes, economic, unfair treatment of the third estate. That's the social, the estates general. The ideas there is the political. Storming of the Bastille, of course, is the tipping point. How did you address that? So all of those are addressed in the rubric. All of these are addressed in the rubric. So there you go. And so let's talk about what needs to be included there. Even though a lot of your notes from first semester will end up helping you with that, let's talk about what needs to be included in that. So before the French Revolution, the nation was on, as you know, the French nation was on the brink of bankruptcy from years of deficit spending by Louis XVI. Those clergy and nobles, that first and second estate, those of you who had me did the cartoon. We did the cartoons that really talked about how the first and second estate were treated, resisted those attempts to help them make them pay taxes. The majority of the French people, 97% almost, let's even say that in here, formed the third estate. Well, politically, we talked about how they don't have the diverse group of peasant urban workers. They resented the privileges enjoyed by those in social status, especially paying taxes, while the first and second estate did not. The third estate had to pay taxes, especially having to pay taxes. Um, Now, remember, then the estates general, they were outvoted every time, and by a 2-to-1 margin. So the Enlightenment ideas, the Rousseau, Voltaire, Locke, end up leading many of them to question these inequalities. They wanted meaningful voting rights in the third estate. So we should say, outvoted. They were outvoted every time because they only had one vote, right? We should say that they were outvoted every time because they only had one vote. The delegates of the third state formed called the National Assembly to force this was the tennis court oath, right? They went out and formed a National Assembly that they called the tennis court oath that allowed them to participate in government. However, rumors spread that the king was going to dissolve this National Assembly. So these social, economic, and political abuses led the French people to storm the Bastille, that French prison, which was a symbol of these abuses. So those are the major highlights. And remember, the notes from last semester. They probably should have done this last semester. Ran out of time. Notes from last semester, especially the ones about the estate system, slides 1, 2, 3. You can still get to those if you do a search in your drive. Those are there. But I gave you kind of the overview of what this was, and how this ends up looking and able to address the social, political, economic aspects. And again, when you're putting them in, it is important that you go in and use and highlight them into these colors as you're addressing them. Highlight them in these colors as you are addressing them, so that I know that you understand it. Okay, you say, "Well, I put it in there." Yeah, the point is, I need to know that you understand. Okay. So that's one question. The other one is one we've done just recently this semester. We started out with it. the similarities and differences, the opening excerpts of the key points of the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and how they outline the similarities and differences each nation was experiencing, comparing and contrasting them, and how they outline the similarities and differences each nation was experiencing at that time. So see the rubric, and again, here's the rubric for this description: three differences, two differences. The purpose of each is clearly defined, and the similarities and differences are clearly defined um, as we start going through. So similarities, differences, and the purposes. So highlight those in each in a different color. Highlight those each in a different color. So to remind you, remember, one of these things you were supposed to do was, and this is where assignment 2, the Declaration of Independence versus Declaration of Rights of Man, will help you. So you pull this out, and you can look at that. Um, the ways that the French and American Revolution were similar. You were supposed to have done this as your last question on assignment 2, but let's look at it from the text. But let's look at these. Um, to help us here. So the American and French revolutions were similar in that they were both inspired by Enlightenment ideals. Remember, it began with calls for reform and ended in a change in government. Those are ways that they're very similar, right? In general, involved involved people rising up against monarchies and taxes and broke out after years of powerful rulers imposing their will on the people. So they were, people were rising up against the monarchies and taxes. Again, unfair taxes, where we went through that. Both started because of unhappy with the tax system. Both wanted freedom of speech and religion. Both were talking of liberty. You've got this in your assignment 2, in your assignment 2 notes. You've got this in your assignment 2 notes. So don't forget, the ones that you turned in here, the assignment 2 notes. You've got them there, as well as in that text section if you answered this question. Um, but coming back to this, the people, the colonists wanted the power of the monarchy limited, while France was influenced by limiting the monarch during the English Glorious Revolution. Remember, that was the idea that when William and Mary came back, they were confirming the supremacy of Parliament over the monarch. So, but there was different political traditions in both. Um, um, Involved people rising up against the monarchy taxes and broke out after years of powerful rulers imposing their will on people. They were both different in their political traditions and social climate. The French were looking for equality. The Americans, remember, they were looking for freedom and independence. Remember, this takes place a little after the Declaration of Rights of Man is based on more, not only on the Declaration of Independence, but ideas of the Enlightenment and in the Constitution. So after the French Revolution, a new republic is set up that did not last ultimately. Remember, Napoleon, Robespierre ends up taking it down, and Napoleon is crowned emperor. Now, the American new republic, of course, still survives to this day, thanks to a constitution that can be amended, and that those are important. So after the American Revolution, the Constitution forbid the creation of a state-supported church. Another aspect, religion. France continued to give the church, Catholic Church, state support. So that's another difference as well. Remember, with the reign of terror and the radicals, there wasn't as much. The republic wasn't going to last in France, and in fact, it wouldn't. Napoleon takes it back to being an emperor, and then they try to bring it back to a republic. And over the course of time, they actually have a series of dictators in France over the 1800s related to Napoleon, and we'll get into that later on. But the, the involved people, again, both involve rising up against monarchies and taxes, again, unhappiness with the tax system. They both wanted to reform government. They were both unhappy with their situation, but in slightly different ways. The American colonists wanted the power of the monarchy limited, while France was influenced by limiting the monarch during the Glorious Revolution. So they both wanted the power of the monarchy limited, and they were both, but a little bit different in in the American colonies, they really didn't want to deal with a monarch at all. As we know, we are very resistant to monarchs. So you could say limited or eliminated here. They limited or eliminated. While France was okay with they would be happy with just a constitutional monarchy. Many of the moderates would have been happy with just a constitutional monarchy. So these are some similarities and differences in our we talk about them here too up in the Venn diagram. So if you make reference to what you did with in this, your question about what ways was the American Revolution similar to the French Revolution, you should be fine. But you also need to look at as you're answering this as you're answering this question, making reference to the document and in how why the National Assembly was formed and so on, and then making reference to um, um, the ideas of the Enlightenment and the ideas of the ideas that they want what they were looking for. So again, some of these comparing and contrasting these um, the key points that were made here in the Declaration of Rights of Man, the Declaration of Independence, and how the, the similarities and differences of each nation was experiencing at the time and what was the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, we talked about that. That's from your Venn diagram. This is where a lot of your Venn diagram is going to help you. What was the purpose of each of these documents? And remember, we had a question, question 1 and 2 on these. Also compared the purpose of those documents. So go back to that as well. Again, assignment 2 will help you extensively with this. Okay, so remember to highlight your when you're writing your paragraphs in a color other than black. Remember to highlight when you make these points. 'Cause I want to know that you understand this as part of meeting the challenges of the rubric. Fair number of points coming out, test points to start the semester. So hopefully we'll start out strong.